So I'm actually really excited. I don't think we've ever been on a stage together.
Is that actually true?
I
don't know
think so.
Wow, okay. It feels like we've done a million miles together, so it's kind of
We have definitely done a
surprising.
million miles together, that much I know. But a great opportunity for everybody in this room is to kind of pick your brain a little bit to understand where are you coming from, what is the direction that HashiCorp's coming in, especially like what is the strategic vision? Because I think one thing that I get a lot of and people mention is just how do you come up with these ideas and how do you turn them into a reality? And the first one probably being that kind of idea of platform and platform teaming. So as you see the ecosystem evolve and as we're building out our products, things like Waypoint, which people have been really excited about today, how do you really see the role of platform teams evolving and especially enhancing the operational efficiencies within organizations?
Yeah, that's a good one. And maybe I'll tie it back to your point on sort of like how do we see some of this stuff. So I think we often get this question of like, is it coming from vision, right? And it's like, I think maybe a tiny part of that is that, but I think a lot of it's actually just observation. Like, I think one of the fun parts of our jobs is we get to talk to, thousands of enterprise customers kind of going through this journey. And so I think in many ways, it's almost just observing the good, bad, and ugly of like, what's working, what's not working, what are world-class companies doing, and sort of like, what are the sort of patterns within that can be sort of, recreated or, and some of it productized.
Yeah.
So I think to me, what sort of, when I look at platform, it kind of comes out of that sort of almost natural notion of how do you have sort of specialized expertise, a specialization of labor within an organization where you can kind of encapsulate and say, okay, these people are going to be my cloud experts. And really for everyone else, it should be a consumption experience of cloud. It becomes a utility, right? I open the tap, I get water. Everyone has to be a plumber, right? To sort of figure out how that works. So, and I think that when we've seen it go the other direction where it's sort of like every app team is sort of has to become app experts or cloud experts, what you end up finding is, great, the 10% of people who are super passionate, they're going to figure it out. The other 90% of people have no idea how to do cloud. Or worse, they know enough to be dangerous. And then it's like now you're constantly playing cleanup on them of like, okay, your S3 buckets are all public, your security groups are allow all, right? Like they just create a mess. Or your bill comes and you're like, why is everything running on a quadruple extra large 128 core machines? So, I think it's like you have a whole spectrum of dangerous to competent, and I think, it's not, when you look at that curve, you have more on the dangerous side and not enough on the competent side. So to me, platform is almost a natural reaction to that. You say, okay, how do you scale the competence? Well, you put them in a central group. They're the ones who design the platform. Everyone else just consumes the platform. And I think when I look at the organizations that did cloud earliest, they were sort of cloud native. That was natural to them, right? When we worked with the Twitches of the world who started building in 2012 in cloud, they're like, yeah, obviously, platform team builds this, everyone else consumes. Now, I think for a lot of enterprises, that was more of a transition. You were coming out of a traditional IT org, maybe it's ticket-driven. Cloud, to some degree, was about escaping the ticket-driven mentality.
Yeah.
So I think app teams were like almost shadow ITing when they went to cloud. So the idea of gatekeeping by a platform team, they didn't like.
Yeah.
Flash forward 10 years into the cloud journey for a lot of enterprises, it's like, okay, we did the shadow IT. Now we've made the mess. Now we've cleaned up the mess 5 different times. How do we prevent it? Now you're going to put a platform team in place.
Okay. So for somebody like me who comes from financial services and everything is slow and highly regulated, what would be your recommendation for a first step into that platform team and like really embracing the idea of scalability and efficiency?
So to me, I think you're never going to have a one-size-fits-all platform. I think that's the other mistake I see people make, which is like, we're going to build this one perfect Garden of Eden that everyone will consume. It'll be the 5 patterns or whatever. And it's not practical for a large enterprise, especially not anything in financials, right? Because you're going to have COTS applications. You're going to have some weird legacy app that talks to Hazelcast, right? Like you're just going to have all this random stuff. Yeah. So to me, when I look at it, you say, well, what's a practical layer cake strategy? And what I mean by that is at the base layer, you say, okay, foundationally, I'm going to do infrastructure as code. Because to me, I think that's table stakes to actually get cloud correct. So I'm going to do an infrastructure as code layer. Maybe I'm going to say, I'm going to give you a Terraform as a service. I'm going to create common, let's say Terraform modules for the top 30, 40, 50 patterns within the bank, everything from load balancers to autoscalers to Java app to database, et cetera. And then I'm going to put the policy guardrail around that. And now I can say, okay, if you're a superpower user, you don't even need my modules, but you have to go through my infrastructure as code pipeline and you're subject to my policy. If you're slightly less than a superpower user, you can use my pre-built modules, and that's my top 30, 40, 50 patterns. So I think that gets you most of the way there. And then I think the top layer of the cake becomes something like the waypoint stuff we talked about, where you say, okay, you're maybe less mature, you're not even going to do infrastructure as code, but I'm going to give you a low-code, no-code experience. And so to me, I think ideally you can get to a place where maybe 60, 70, 80% of apps are in that low-code level. Maybe the next 15% are in that sort of using reusable modules. So it's sort of, you get the repeatability. And then there's always going to be the 5% that is just special cased, and you have to have that sort of bottom layer. I think the mistake is starting with the top layer versus the bottom, because I think the bottom layer is your catch-all. If you can do that, that can handle 100% of the apps, and then you sort of work your way up to higher leverage, but less maybe less suitable for every app.
Oh, thank you so much. I love how practical and actionable that is, because we do talk a lot about it, and you're kind of left going, oh, okay, but in practice, what does this look like, and how do you go about that? I'm going to open it up. Does anybody out there have any questions for Armin? That's what I thought. Okay.
Hi, can you hear me? Yeah. How do you see Terraform maturing over the next 5 years in terms of a developer environment where you can do drag and drop and bring those services without even knowing about Terraform code?
Good question. Okay, so maybe I'll repeat it because I'm not sure if everybody could hear it. Which is basically, how do we see Terraform evolving over the next 5 years? What's the role of maybe more like drag and drop kind of WYSIWYG type interfaces? And I think there was a third piece that I couldn't quite hear what you were saying, but I don't know if I captured that entirely. Integrated development sort of experience. Okay, great. So the way I think about it is kind of a few different directions, right? I think one is today, if I look at Terraform today, what its main, I'd say, strength is kind of that day one provisioning experience and then day N when you're decommissioning. I think that leaves a whole gap in the middle when I talk about day 2, day 3, day N sort of operations, where historically that's been a point where we've said, you know what, that's just not Terraform's strong suit. Go use a different tool like Ansible, where it can go fill in the gap on things like runbook automation or ad hoc eventing, where it can handle the fact that you have existing infrastructure and you need to do something imperative. I think now with some of the news that we've talked about, I think bringing those things closer together and making Terraform a little bit more aware of something like being able to do runbook orchestration or day 2 actions as part of Terraform provides almost a continuous, a single way of thinking about infrastructure as code that's across that full lifecycle versus sort of today it's a little bit fragmented and kind of left, exercise left to reader of how you integrate. So I think that's kind of piece one, is how do we sort of span that whole day 1 to day N experience and solve some of the gaps we have on some of the ad hoc events. Then when I think about the layering of it, a lot of the sort of vision you saw around Waypoint is really pushing us towards what does more of that no-code experience look like. So to me, I actually don't think about it as you'd want the WYSIWYG for Terraform. I actually think you'd want the WYSIWYG for the Waypoint layer, because I think that becomes the different abstractional layer. In fact, I'll take it one level further, which is I think one of the things that is actually a really good fit for natural language processing and some of the Gen AI stuff is at that layer. Is if you could have a developer that comes and say, hey, I want a new Java app, I'm going to call it Foo, and I want it on Amazon, and I want Mongo, and I want Redis with it. You should be able to just almost give a specification, almost in natural language like that, and then be able to have that turned into a Waypoint specification where it's just telling you, hey, this is what I think you asked for. You wanted Java on Amazon with these dependencies, and here's how it should look. Does that look right to you? And you can just hit accept, and then you can kind of have a much higher level experience with it. I think then connecting that into something like VS Code for a developer, that's how you get into sort of that truly integrated experience, where from a developer's viewpoint, they maybe have a high level definition metadata about what they want in their app. It's directly integrated into their IDE so that they can, those actions we talked about, they could invoke them from within their sort of IDE. It's like, great, I hit save, looks good, my test passed, I want to run a build action. I should be able to do that integrated within it. So to me, I think that's going to be more of the direction. I think thinking about developers as using Waypoint as the front end and operators as really using Terraform as how they specify the environment. That's kind of how I think about it, as opposed to Terraform becoming a developer tool necessarily. And behind the scenes, the developers using it, but not necessarily as the front end.
Okay. And do you see the Waypoint as being the main internal developer platform?
One of them, I think. So I think part of our view, and I know a few people mentioned Backstage today, is, I think Ruben said it well today, this morning on stage when he was chatting with me, which is, I think there's a need for a certain orchestration layer. And I think the challenge with some of the things like Backstage is they don't have an opinionated model of like, what's the data model? How does that tie back to role-based access control? How would you tie that into change management integration to ServiceNow or something? So I think you need some of that that's a bit more opinionated as to what does that backend actually look like to be able to do the orchestration and handle networking into multiple environments, multiple clouds, staging, production, et cetera. So my view is I think we're going to build obviously a rich front end to Waypoint, but it'll also be API driven. So you could treat Waypoint as almost a headless orchestrator. And if you wanted to create your own front end, you could do that with something like a Backstage. But that just becomes sort of almost a stateless front end where you can customize the UI and make the widgets and workflow make sense for your company. But then all the orchestration and heavy lifting from a domain model, secret management, threading through of sort of state between environments, that could be handled almost headlessly by Waypoint. So that's kind of how I'm thinking about it over time, is you could use it directly as the IDP. You could use it as the engine to really put a UI on top of it if you wanted to customize further.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thanks so much. Christian, I saw your hand go up over here.
Hey, Ramon, really good speech this morning. So I counted 9 products, if I'm correct. So my question is really around how many of those products are you using to build your own services? Are you using all of them? And which ones are you not using? And is there a gap that you see and you're developing a 10th product that we're all waiting for?
That's a good question. We didn't have enough products, so you needed a 10th, I see. I'm trying to think, is there anything we don't use? So, I mean, if we look at HCP platform itself, it, as you would expect, runs on top of the full Hashi stack. So it's running on top of Nomad and Consul as the runtime. It's all secured with Vault. It's deployed with Terraform. It's actually very meta. We use Terraform Enterprise to deploy HCP, which then is used to deploy itself. So it's a very circular set of dependencies. And then the image build pipeline for all of that stuff is Packer, as you'd expect. It's funny. We actually used to buy a product, Truffle, from Truffle Security to do our secret scanning. Obviously, that we then bought and built Radar, so now we use our own Radar product. What am I missing? Did I miss anything in there?
Boundary.
Oh, Boundary we use for access to our production environment. And then Vagrant we use to actually do all of the testing for things like Nomad, Consul, et cetera. So when our developers bring up, all of our QA and test environments are done using Vagrant. So I think we pretty much use the entirety of the stack. Now, that's not to say we build everything that we use. So there's obviously lots of other stuff. We're a big GitHub user. We're a big Datadog user. We're a big Okta user. So there's a bunch of other stuff. I don't think we're planning to build our own Okta anytime soon. So I think 9 products feels good for now.
What about Waypoint? What do we do internally with Waypoint?
Waypoint's interesting. So actually, it's funny. We started with Backstage ourselves internally before we had Waypoint. And I think we got it to a certain point where we were like, okay, but how do we actually maintain this thing? Because it has no domain model and there's no access control. And we're sort of like building all this stuff ourselves. And at some point, we realized our customizations were so significant that we had basically built a different product at that point. And so that's what actually triggered us to go create Waypoint, was basically we had built 2 versions of it. We had a Backstage version and then a different thing we called Waffles, sort of internally, which was the tool that we used to build and deploy Terraform Cloud. And we're like, okay, we have 2 different things that are both kind of bespoke and unmaintainable. Can we actually build a product, which turned into Waypoint, which then we use to do some of our deployment orchestration? That's probably the one that we could leverage more internally. I think the biggest gap actually was the actions work that was missing. And so now that actions is there, we probably can more heavily leverage Waypoint than we were in the past.
And so when we're looking at Waypoint and we're saying we want to migrate to Waypoint, what's the first step in migrating to Waypoint?
And that's a really good question, because I think the interesting challenge is people look at Waypoint, they think it's for Greenfield, which I think is true today in the way it's generally modeled. It's generally more applicable for Greenfield. I think over time, the way we're looking at this to both solve for ourselves as well as customers is, if you looked at the way we talked about a lot of the patterns, for example, they're all just Terraform, right? So it's like when we did a template, that was instantiating a Terraform workspace. When I did an add-on, that was just instantiating a Terraform workspace. So our view is if you have things already modeled as Terraform workspaces, you should be able to import them by basically linking them to an existing Waypoint app. So that'll be kind of the next flow, and we'll probably announce that later this year, is basically if I have a Waypoint application, rather than sort of that flow that we showed where we sort of went new template, new add-on, there'll be one which is like link an existing workspace, and then you can go to Terraform Cloud and say, hey, I have this existing workspace, foo, link that to my Waypoint app, also called foo, and now there's a linkage between them. So that way you can actually take brownfield stuff, as long as it's being modeled with Terraform, and basically bring it into Terraform's management,
Nice.
or Waypoint's management.
Brilliant. I like that. Do we have any other questions out there? In the back there? Try to spread it out a little bit.
Oh, you really picked the ultimate corner. Thank you for
I have
Mike
to
running for
I
us.
have to commit.
Hello, hello. Can you see me back there? Can you hear me okay? Yeah, I'm shouting a bit now. So as an organisation that are relatively mature on our cloud journey, but are only users of kind of open source products, and we think we know the answer, but I kind of want to go to the source and ask this. Where do you recommend that we start with kind of paid products? Not only to kind of quickly see a return on investment, but it's easy enough to kind of make that cultural shift and start that journey in a positive way.
Okay, that's a good question. I'd say a lot of organizations we work with tend to start with Vault, and I think there's a few reasons for that one. I think one is once Vault gets to a certain operational sort of level of criticality, you sort of treat it like, or hopefully you treat it like a tier 1 service. And so there's just a very clear case when you look at, okay, from a disaster recovery, high availability, actually I was just talking to a customer right before this who they were talking about in their migration from open source to enterprise. They lost the recovery keys on their open source Vault cluster. And so it created a very compelling event to migrate the users off of that cluster and onto their enterprise one. So I think this is a classic example of like what happens is most people start with a Vault and it's almost like, oh, one team in a corner is using it and it's not being treated like a tier 1 service, sort of like a tier 3. And so like there's not that much attention paid to the availability, the backup of data, the recovery key management. And then one day you wake up and realize it is a tier 1 service, but nobody's done any of that hardening until it goes down. And then you realize like, oh shit, it took down, 100 apps with it. And so to me, I think there's a really obvious case of looking at that and saying, okay, if you treat this like a tier 1 service, which for most people it is, what would you expect from an enterprise architecture perspective in terms of your key management, your data replication, your hardening against a data center failure, all of those things. And those are all the things that are solved for within the enterprise version. And then you look at, the other example the gentleman just gave was what happens when you have one bad client basically DDoS the cluster. And so then you look at an enterprise-grade deployment where we recommend things like you have multiple namespaces to do tenant isolation, you're putting quotas and rate limits in place, so if one client goes rogue, they don't take the whole cluster down. So all that's really a part of taking, hey, we're clearly getting value out of this thing, it's solving a secret management problem for us, but often it's not architected in a truly enterprise-grade HA way in open source. So it's really saying, great, let's just upgrade that and then really treat it as a hardened tier 1 service. So I think that tends to be a great start point.
I saw another hand mic over here. Sorry, Maud. Making sure you get your steps in today.
Gonna navigate a maze, it looks like.
With HCP becoming more of a headline, I think, that we saw this morning, can you give us a bit more as to where that's heading from a self-managed situation that a lot of the products are in at the moment? How are you going to encourage your customers to go to HCP, not worry about the actual looking after the platforms themselves and leave it to you guys that know what you're doing?
Super good question. So I think there's maybe two answers within that same question, which is for the first part is the self-managed products aren't going to go anywhere, right? Because our fundamental worldview is that it's going to be a hybrid cloud world, right? I think we work with a lot of customers who they have air-gapped data centers, they have manufacturing plants, they have retail stores that fundamentally have to be able to operate in an offline way, right? And so our view is it's going to be a hybrid world. You're going to have cloud, but you're also going to have lots of things that need to be offline. And I don't think data centers are going anywhere anytime soon. So where, there's no divestiture or anything happening from the self-managed products. At the same time, I think a lot of people are realizing, well, some of this stuff is undifferentiated lift for me to run it myself, right? Like, if I don't need an offline mode of operation, or I'm using Terraform Enterprise to manage cloud, okay, well, by definition, you sort of have a dependency on cloud anyways, if you're not managing a purely on-premise state. So then it's like, okay, if it's just undifferentiated lift, why should I even bother, right? Versus I think if you're in cloud, you get access to the features faster. There's a set of things like some of the Gen AI capabilities that you're only going to get in cloud, right? Those aren't coming back. So I think we're looking at it and saying, ideally, we try and maintain as much feature parity as we can between self-managed and cloud, but there's some class of things that we're building where it's just impractical, right? We're not going to ask customers to be like, please give us 500 NVIDIA cards or like run an Elastic cluster in a Snowflake warehouse and all this stuff. It's going to be like, well, if you want some of those capabilities, they're only going to be in cloud because we can reasonably run all that infrastructure and you don't have to see it. But nobody would want to manage Terraform Enterprise if you're like, bring Postgres, Redis, Elastic, Snowflake, Cassandra. You'd be like, Jesus. And by the way, keep up to date every month when we push a new version too, right? Customers will be like, no. In fact, we already get pressure that we have too many updates. People are like, can you do less updates? So there's this sort of tension between, well, we want to continue to innovate and push new capabilities, but there's a maximum digest rate that customers have for self-managed, which is really not more than 1 to 2 updates a year. Versus in cloud, we're doing bi-weekly sprints. So every 2 weeks, there's new capabilities landing. So it just creates this fundamental disconnect. And I think the carrot becomes, hey, if you want the latest and greatest and you don't want to have to operate this stuff, you're going to want to move to cloud. And then we're going to try our best to maintain a high level of parity between cloud and self-managed.
Are we out of time? Oh, wow. Okay. Well, that went really fast. Apologies. Armin, as always, thank you so much. You give so much insight and so much knowledge and bring so much to HashiCorp, both on the technical side, but also just who you are and the community that you've put together. I think that's a huge testament to what we've created and will continue to do moving forward. So thank you so much. Thank you all for joining us today, taking the day to spend time with us, hear stories from your peers, chat a little bit, do some networking. Louise, I have to hand this back over to you because I don't know what's going on next.
You missed the most important part of happy hour.
I think Louise is going to cover that.